Hi everyone, welcome to the Startup Operator Podcast. I'm Roshan Karyappa, and today I'll be speaking to Abhijit Vijayvargiya, who is the co-founder and CEO of Nectar.ai, a sales automation tool that's focused at helping B2B sellers. Before this, Abhijit spent about 9 years at Capillary, one of the best-known SaaS companies in India. And in his last role there, he was president and managing director of APAC and Global Accounts. And he has the unique distinction of scaling sales from zero to $50 million in revenue. Welcome, Abhijit. Thanks so much for being on the Startup Operator podcast.
Hey Roshan, thanks for having me over here. Very excited to chat with you today.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks so much for making the time. I know you're an avid runner, and Singapore has opened up recently. So, did you get a good morning run?
I did. In fact, most of my June was a lot of running. So I took a challenge to run 225 kilometers in the
Wow.
month of June. Yeah, and I just finished it just in time on the last day. So it was like closing a quarter, right? I mean, just the way in sales, I used to have like the last day of the quarter, you'll punch
Yeah,
in a
yeah.
lot of deals. So I punch in a lot of kilometers there. Then I took a little bit of break in first week of July, and then like today was the first day in July. I again went for a long run. So I typically go for like a 8-10K whenever I go for a run. So it was quite
Nice.
enjoyable though.
Nice. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know how how you guys do that last day of the quarter thing. It's nerve-wracking actually, seriously. So
Yeah, so I like setting goals. I mean, being a sales guy, I think that's now in the DNA. I
yeah,
like goals. I've become clueless if I don't have a goal in front of me. So even if I don't have a goal, I like to set one and then I like to chase it. And then I think, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of fun and exhilaration when you go on to the last day, last week, and the whole joy of like achieving that goal, right? I mean, so that's
right,
true to sales. Yeah.
right. So speaking of lofty goals, Capillary has been a heck of a story, right? And why don't you take us through that journey a little bit? I mean, did you know Anish from college, or and what prompted you to jump on board?
Yeah, I mean, Anish, KK, most of the founding team at Capillary for that matter, and a lot of like initial employees there were like all close friends. They mostly from IIT Kharagpur,
Right,
where that's where I also went, and I knew when they started. I've been a well wisher since then, and for the first couple of years, I think they were looking at a product market fit, and then they achieved it quite quickly. I think I do remember when they won a Q Prize contest in US. It was, I think, powered by Qualcomm,
right,
and Capillary was a runner-up there. They won the 100K prize as a for the business plan contest competition. So that's when I think we had a chat, and they mentioned to me that they are seeing a product market fit and they are seeing a good traction and a good validation. I also was like getting married around that time, so I just wanted to settle on my personal front. And yeah, the early 2011, it was the right timing when they had just like got the product market fit. I also like got married, so I think I, I was like completely available then to like embark upon a new journey on the professional front, and I joined them. Yeah.
right. So what were the early days like? I mean, if you were to split your journey into different phases, right? Maybe 0 to 1, 1 to 10, and 10 to 50, right? Take us through the 0 to 1 journey. What were the challenges like, and how did you overcome them?
Yeah, I think it's not just to Capillary. It's unique to I think most startups. I think all startups go through similar challenges, and they have to navigate those. And it's a global fact. So 0 to 1 is a very different experience versus a 1 to 10, and a 10 to 25, and then a 25 to 50. And I've not experienced any journey beyond 50, so I won't be able to comment on that. But yeah, I think when I've seen these different phases of a company, the different things that one needs to do and focus on, and it's very easy to get distracted. I think the first and foremost thing that's true across all these phases is focus. I think a lot of startups die because they lose focus and they get distracted from the
Right,
core mission on which they started. So
right,
it doesn't mean that you can't pivot. I think pivoting is different. You definitely should pivot as you evolve as a company. You achieve product market fit. You see traction. I think it's always important to keep pivoting to optimize as a company. But at the same time, you should not be doing too many things at the same time. That's a very common mistake I've seen a lot of startups make. So I would say in the 0 to 1 journey, I think any startup should typically focus on uh, figuring out what is it that you're solving for. I mean, every startup starts with a vision, right? You have a problem that you feel is unsolved, and that's something which you can solve, and you feel you can uniquely solve in a way that nobody is solving it today, and you can do it X times better in case it's already solved by somebody. And you go ahead and create a product or a solution or an offering around it. Now, how you get to that is very important, right? I mean, this whole 0 to 1 journey of iterating is very important. A lot of time, I've seen startups forcing growth or forcing a product market fit. As an initial team member, you would see if you have a product market fit or not, and that's very important for you to realize. So I would always advise that don't force the scale up motion till the time you hit that product market fit. So 0 to 1, I mean, it's quite important there for any startup to stay focused, get to that product market fit, iterate fast, evolve to solving that problem that you intended to solve for, and solve it uniquely and in a way that there is a commercial value attached to it, that you create a meaningful difference to the user or the buyer, that they're willing to pay a price to get your solution, right? So it's quite important there.
Yeah.
And once you achieve that 0 to 1, I think that 1 to 10 journey is all about scaling and doubling down on
Yeah.
what works, right? I mean,
I
so
think
that's been my biggest.
yeah, so the 0 to 1, I think you're just really trying to validate your product value proposition, basically, right? So,
Yeah,
is
yeah,
there a market for your product, and is there a product that you could fit to the market, essentially? I like
yeah,
what Naval Ravikant says. I mean, he says that you don't really pivot, right? I mean, you don't really jump. What you do is keep your foot in one place and then move the other foot around until you get that, sort of a fit, basically, right? Yeah, because that is one huge misconception that a lot of people have, which is that 0 to 1 you just do a bunch of different things to figure out what works. Rather, I mean, it's about taking those calibrated steps in order to find and validate your value proposition. Yeah, yeah.
exactly. Yeah, yeah.
So the 1 to 10 journey is often called the valley of death, right? I mean, there is a very, very
Yes.
minuscule number of startups that are able to make that journey. So what was that journey like? What did you guys? So okay, here you are at $1 million in revenue. You have a core value proposition that's validated. Now you have to kind of scale this right from 1 to 10. So what is your vision like in that framework of mind, right? So what do you think of?
I think it's very important by this time when you hit like $1 million in ARR to understand what has made you come this far, right? I mean, have you truly hit that product market fit? And if you have not taken shortcuts in the 0 to 1 journey, you'll be in a great position to then start scaling. So what you need to constantly look at is that what is the problem that you have solved, how you have solved it, which are the other customers similar to this customer with whom you have worked, where you can go and sell this, or which are the similar users who face the same problem and you can go and solve that problem for them. It's quite important that one does that, because I've seen that a lot of times startups would start distracting at this stage because they would have some growth targets and they would like want to get to that $10 million very fast. And in order to do that, they'll spread themselves thin, right? I mean, they'll start opening up new markets, they'll start launching new products, they'll start talking to different sectors of customers. So in that case, what's happening is yeah, anyway, in the product market fit journey, you would have taken certain shortcuts, or you hard coded a few things, you would have iterated a bit. So you have some sort of a base, but the base is something which is not yet ready to be loaded with so many distractions and so many multiple things that are going around. So what's very important is that what has worked so far on the product standpoint, on your marketing standpoint, on your sales motion, you templatize that. I mean, you create a solid, rock solid foundation and then do more of it, right? I mean, so what's important is doubling down on the product, doubling down on sales, doubling down on marketing. Do more of what has worked for you. If you just do that, it's a very simple thing. I mean, that's just one thing I would recommend, that if you just do that more and more and keep doubling down on what you have been doing so far, I think that 1 to 10 million journey becomes quite easy. So just an example there, I mean, Capillary, we saw retail as a sector where we saw a lot of product market fit. That was one of the first sectors where we saw a great value we could deliver. And we could figure out that there is a certain set of retail customers which basically have between 100 to 500 stores. They are a sweet spot for us. That's like largely mid-market retail, and that's something which we can go ahead and start selling. And even within that, we figured out that fashion and apparel was a category was like really good for us. We could immediately add value. Anyone who tries the product within the third month, they see ROI, right? So that was a great example through which we just ended up doing more of that, and we ended up like talking to more and more customers in different parts of the country. We started in India, and then we started doing the same thing for Southeast Asia, Middle East, and some of the other markets, and we saw a lot of success.
Right.
Then we moved into like an adjacent vertical within retail. So we saw F&B, and we saw like Pizza Hut was a good customer. We saw a lot of value that we could deliver to them. We did more of that, and we saw that in F&B it was very fragmented. So rather than going for SMB, we just went with more customers like Pizza Hut, and we just went with Pizza Hut also to more markets. So because
Right.
we had a template that was working, and then we just ended up doing more and more, and that's where we started things like global accounts, where we would work with one brand and we'll try to engage with them in different parts of the world,
Yeah.
right? So that really helped. So the point there was that we did more of the same thing, and that I would say is very important, and it's easy to
Right.
say, but then it's very difficult to do. It's very easy to get distracted as
Yeah.
as a founding team or leadership team to do different things in order to get to $10 million.
Right.
Yeah.
So, I mean, essentially, you have like three ways you can grow your business, right? So, one is that you solve bigger problems for the same clients, right? Which means that expanding your product base a little more, adding more features, solutions, workflows, whatever that is, right? The other is to move into an adjacent industry. You know, you're serving, let's say, fashion and apparel. You move into F&B or whatever. The third is looking at markets that could be similar, right? And I want to pick on the third one because I think that is something that Capillary did fantastically well, which is growing outside of India, right? To places like Southeast Asia, even China, and so on. So you want to talk about how you picked these markets and how do you go about solving for that market?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it's very important that every startup answers it for themselves,
Mm.
because the answer on what could be your target market could be different, right? I mean, some startups from day one would focus on US,
Mm.
and you'll have to build the product with keeping that market in mind, the user experience there, the nuances that are involved there. So from day one of the founding team members need to be present there and need to be thinking about it. Similarly, if your market is India alone, and I think B2C India is the bigger market, you need to be thinking about that. But if you are in B2B SaaS, where you see that, and that's where I think at Capillary we had a situation that retail was not a great sector in US at that time. It was like Amazon was killing it,
Mm.
and most of the retailers were dying, and it's still struggling, right? As a sector in US, it's all moved online, and this was like 2011, 2012 when we were looking at it. So we just felt that which are the other markets then we can look at. And retail was growing quite well in emerging markets.
Mm.
So for us, the answer lied in the industry that we operated, right? I mean, we were selling it to retailers. I think Southeast Asia was a great market. Middle East was a great market for retail. They were all growing markets. So it was a very natural thing for us to do, to expand into Southeast Asia and Middle East initially, and then later on go into China.
Right.
And that's what we ended up doing. We focused on emerging markets, and we looked at our sector, and we looked at how our sector was growing. So our market, addressable market itself was growing by 20-30% annually. And it's and on the first place, the core market in Asia itself was quite big, right? So it just gave us the answer that, okay, we can just double down here and do more of it. The second thing was around similarities, right? I mean, I think the buyer behavior within Asia is quite similar compared to buyer behavior in the West. So we ended up looking at that very closely, and we realized that our sales cycle, the sales process, the way we are approaching it is going to be similar to what we had in India, and we could like learn from what we've already done. So the similar playbooks could work in Indonesia, in Singapore, Malaysia, Philippines, or Thailand, or if you look at Middle East, in Dubai or Saudi Arabia or Turkey for that matter, right? I mean, and even China, I think there were a lot of similarities. Obviously, there are language nuances and cultural nuances that one must embrace, and you need to localize a bit there.
Mm.
But in general, with respect to what buyers would look into a product, right? I mean, in Asia, they look for value for money, right? I mean, they look at like, you need to be able to do a lot more. So it's a one-stop shop solution that sells better, versus US, where I think you look at a specialist, right? I mean, so US is a very vertically driven market, whereas Asia is very horizontal market that way, right? I mean, they'll expect you to do more at a lower cost, whereas in US they'll pay the premium for a specialist. So that was like one of the difference I noticed. So it's very important for as a company that you look at what's going to be your focus. So who is the user, who is the buyer, which are these companies that you can solve the problem for, which markets they are present, and what's the opportunity. So I would say if you have a big enough market in Asia, I think it's not a bad idea to, like, after you're doing India, start selling into Southeast Asia and Middle East in parallel. It just helps you to grow faster uh, and get a lot of like high margin revenue in, because our deals were much higher value in Southeast Asia and Middle East
Yeah.
versus what we used to have in India. So our gross margins definitely were higher, and yeah, there was a network effect as well, right? I mean, if you're working with one brand in one country, there are people who are basically talking to each other within different countries of in this MNCs, and you get introductions and you just start farming a lot more into the account, right? So the whole key account concept becomes a lot more amplified as well.
Right.
And yeah, and if you're looking at US, then I think that whole motion has to be very different.
Right. Also, I think because of the nature of the industry, you guys operated in retail, which is like, huge conglomerate driven sort of a business, right? I mean, I think
Yeah.
it's highly likely that, a brand is present in adjacent neighboring countries and so on. Yeah, so
Agreed.
that's pretty interesting. You make it look pretty, I mean, you make it sound pretty easy, but then, I mean, I'm sure getting those 0 to 5 logos in every new geography would have been quite a fight, right? I mean, you knock on doors, maybe you involve some channel partners, so on, but uh, how would you go and get those 0 to 5 logos in these new geographies?
Yeah, again, I think it depends on what's been your strategy. I think we experimented with direct sales. We've been like a very strong direct sales led organization. We introduced partnerships quite late. I think that's one thing I would say we could have done earlier, because it takes time to like nurture the partnerships and get those partners excited about you, and especially if you're a SaaS product, right? I mean, most of the partnership ecosystem is tuned towards enterprise, right? I mean, the
Right,
conventional enterprise products, and there's a big ecosystem which operates.
right,
Now I think that's changing slightly. You're seeing a lot more partners being available for SaaS products, and they're trying to be there to sell the SaaS offering in their markets. So for
yeah,
us, it was all direct sales led motion. So we experimented with partnerships here and there, but we didn't do a dedicated effort. But yeah, we did a great job at building direct sales team in different countries. So we would definitely hire well. I think we always had great sales talent at the company. We'd also like templatize our sales process. So I think that was always there. And we figured out that how we sell the first, like how the founders sold to like the first 5 people, the first 10 people, and then how from 10 to 20, 20 to 50. I think we could really onboard sales teams in a way that they'll start delivering their first deal within the first 6 months of joining, right? From in a new market. And the way we'll go ahead generating demand was largely again through references and the network that we had built, right? So again, I think the sector we catered to was retail, and then you'll see a lot of like retail talent floating around within these countries, and it's more prominent if it is within Asia, right? I mean, you'll see somebody who's the head of India would move to head the whole APAC region, or you would have somebody who's like a head of Singapore would probably move to Indonesia, right? So a lot of those things will happen. So we
right,
will definitely try to get more and more introductions. So we'll do a lot of reference. So our initial first 5 logos in any new market would come from the network that we created, and the references we'll get from our existing clients. So we always did a great job in retaining our customers. We had the lowest churn in the industry. We still have, and we always like focused on delivering the delight to our users and our customers, that they become our evangelists. So for us, the reference based leads was very important, and that worked. This whole key account motion also helped, where we were like looking at specific accounts, and we're taking more introductions from them with their peers in different markets. So that's how we'll go ahead and like open up a new market, right? We'll probably land
right,
5 meetings which are existing customers, but they are like businesses operating in Indonesia, so similar brands. So it's
right,
one is easy to talk about what you've done with them in the current market, and then try to like templatize that pitch and localize it for their market. I think it definitely resonated. So that's how we build the first 5 logos. And once you get the first 5 logos through
Yeah.
the closed reference network, it becomes easier to scale from there. Then you like do conventional demand gen and sales on top of it.
Right.
Yeah.
And I'm sure customer success would have become even more relevant in your 10 to 50 million journey, right? I mean, you would have mined further all of these accounts and also gotten more references and so on. So
Yeah.
take us through that 10 to 50 million journey, right? So you have validated use cases in a few of these geographies that you're operating in. How do you sort of double down and grow your sales and build that templatized playbook that you talked about?
Yeah. So I think what's important by now is to start looking at what's working for you. And that you would have figured it out from up to 1 million, and then 1 to 10 million, you do more of it, right? But after 10, you need to do something different, right? I mean, you'll start hitting some ceilings in certain markets. So what's more important is that what kind of products that you can build. So you need to continuously innovate, right? I mean, either they are new products or you have to go for price upgrades, or you need to go with like some value that you additionally deliver to what you're currently doing, that you can demand the additional price, or you like increase the number of users that use the product, right? So a lot of those things need to be done. So there's a lot of strategy and product that comes into play when you do like a 10 to 50. It becomes even more important to fuel the growth. Apart from that, obviously on the direct sales side of it, if you need to constantly look at your sales capacity and addressable market, right? So we'd always go into that exercise of what's our addressable market, how many logos are out there, have we spoken to all of them, and if not, how soon can we speak to them, because they all have similar problems, they need us. We need to be out there in those meeting rooms where they are thinking about solving those problems. And in order to do that, you have to increase your outreach. That's where I would say it's also important to get those partnerships going, the affiliates and partnership programs. They become quite important. And then you need to also start doing your direct sales, who basically goes to the next level, right? I mean, you start expanding your team. So from a 10-member sales team, you need to grow to a 25 to a 50. And how those next set of people will be able to do the same productivity, would be able to operate at similar thresholds what your current tenure team is doing. I think that's where some challenges come in, and we would like invest into sales enablement a lot more. So sales enable becomes a lot more important. And then you need to be hiring the VPs at this time, right? I mean, actually you should be hiring VPs around 5 to 6 million. You need to be hiring most VPs for all for your sales functions, from sales to engineering to marketing to product, to even customer success. And you need to get the right talent. I think a lot of startups make a mistake of not hiring stage right. So you'll hire the professionals from the biggest brands who probably are operating at 100 million or $1 billion scale. That is very different versus what a $10 million or a $5 million company that will operate, right? I mean, so that's another big mistake startups make. And there's a lot to learn from like professionals from bigger enterprises who are operating at bigger scale. But I think at the stage at what you are in somewhere around 10 million mark is not where you can use the things that they are currently doing, right? I mean, you need to still hustle, you need to still roll up your sleeves. Your sales head needs to train your sales reps, at the same time go in the field and closing some of the larger deals. At
Be
the
like
same time,
a coach, basically.
be a coach and figure out how they can be predictable at the same time, right? So predictable growth becomes more important, right? I mean, from a 10 to 50 million journey, it's not just about growing, it's also about landing your quarters predictably. So all of those things become very important, and you have to do a variety of things. On the demand gen side, you need to invest a lot more, because if you're not invested in your demand gen around 5 million mark, then you start seeing that your leads are drying up. So you need to start diversifying lead sources. So I think up to 10 million ARR journey, you can probably get more out of 2 to 3 lead sources which have worked well for you, and you double down there. But that doesn't work after 10. So you need to probably expand into like the next 2 or next 3 sources where you get the leads from. You need to be probably doing a lot more on ground marketing and branding. And I think by this time you need to be also be the leaders in some of the initial markets you started.
Right.
So you need to do end game, right? I mean, what I've also seen people do wrong is not doing end game in the core markets where they are seeing success. So they'll open more and more markets, and that will mean that you are spreading thin. At the same time, you're leaving money on table in the existing markets, which you're really good at. So it's very important to go for market share between that 10 to 50, that which are your core markets. If you're doing quite well, then go for market share. And when you're opening new markets, you are opening them strategically. And as soon as you hit $1 million in a new market, then you double down and just get that market to go to a 10 after that, right? I mean, so that's how. So you have to probably keep splitting your startup in different startups at that point of time across all functions. So in sales, if you're opening new markets, you need to be again going through that 0 to 1 journey in that market.
Yeah.
And the existing market where you're doing quite well, you just need to be go for market share. And same thing happens for product engineering and other functions as well.
Yeah, so in some sense, I mean, the product market fit journey is continuous, right? I mean, you may be launching in new geographies. I mean, you may be launching new product verticals or whatever it is, and it's sort of a continuous journey. And at some point of time, some part of your startup is going through that journey, and you have to be sort of cognizant of that, right? So we've spoken a
Definitely.
fair bit about sales, right? And there's this huge debate on whether sales is an art or a science. If sales is a game of superstars, you've mentioned a couple of times that templatize the sales, and you've mentioned playbooks and so on, right? What is your opinion on that?
Yeah, I think I would say sales is one of the most crowded verticals when you look at technology, and so is marketing. I think, to be fair, I think, I mean, if you look building SaaS tools, you're looking at sales, marketing, finance, and HR, right? I mean, what are
Yeah.
the other options you have? And I think most of them are crowded in their own ways. But yeah, when I looked at sales stack, I saw that it's quite crowded. I'll give you some statistics before I like get on to like sharing my viewpoints there. So in US alone, on just sales training, they invest around $19 billion, $19 billion every year. And around sales training related tech, close to $4 billion is spent every year. And then there's a lot of other spends that happens around various tools around engagement, enablement, and CRMs and whatnot. But do you know how many reps met quota last year? If you look at Forbes data of 2019,
Hmm.
just take a wild guess. How many reps globally met their quota last year?
Less than 30%, I would say.
Yeah, so 43% met their quota. That means 57% of the reps globally missed their
Missed that
quota
quota.
attainment, right? Yeah, and over last 5 years, the overall quota attainment globally has declined by 40%. There's been like a great reduction in like
Right.
salespeople attaining their quota, and this is after like so much of say so many sales tools have come, the
Yeah.
investments into training, coaching, consulting have happened. I speak to a lot of like leaders within the founder ecosystem, sales leaders, CROs, and a lot of them have like sales kickoffs. They do annual sales trainings and coaching.
Hmm.
They'll spend anywhere between 50K to 250K in those programs across like their teams flying in, flying out, the specialists who come and speaks there, 1 week, 1 month kind of coaching programs as well. um, I think everybody is very happy, very energetic when all of that happens. But I mean, if you talk to the reps, I mean, they don't remember anything after a week or after a month or after a quarter of that being done. So all that
Right.
money in a way goes in, doesn't get utilized, right? So that's around like the way the whole market is currently positioned. And if you look at like conventional tools which exist today, which basically are tools like CRM, they are, I think, and you guys at Vimo have been also talking about it a lot, and it's quite relevant and it validates. I mean, to see that, I mean, the way you guys have been successful
Right.
is that the whole system of record problem, right? I mean, most CRMs are built to be system of record. I mean, at Vimo, you guys also started disrupting that, and that's where I feel there's a big enough opportunity for companies to come and disrupt and start adding true value to the sales teams. So
Hmm.
when I look at sales stack and when I look at sales productivity in general, I just seen that there are too many tools, but they're not like paying off, or there too much investment that's being
Yeah.
meant in training programs, coaching programs,
Yeah.
consulting programs, but it's not delivering the true ROI. And
Yeah.
finally, I mean, name one tool which is making a rep better at selling. Right, most tools are designed to give reports and dashboards to the organization, or maintain data
Hmm.
into the organization's records. But there's no tool out there which basically is thinking about the sales rep, adding that value to the rep so that they become better at sales, right? So that's where I
Right.
started thinking that there is something to do, and I just saw that as an opportunity, and I initiated my journey.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I mean that's something that yeah, I'm fairly familiar with as well, right? I mean it's been 13 years that I've been in sales and marketing, and the kind of CRMs I've used, uh, you know, uh, it's all very passive. It's all reporting driven. It's a sort of an inspection tool, right? And which is why, I mean, after all of these, after 20 years of CRM, essentially no salesperson will ever stand up and say, "Hey, I love my CRM," right? Or it helps me do my job better. In fact, I mean, what I see is people much prefer their diaries than their CRMs, right? Because they have better expectations, and you don't have your manager looking at it and asking you 1,000 questions on every data point that you put in there, right? So I'm really excited that this problem is being solved by plenty of these new age startups and stuff like that, and they're looking at it the right way, right? In terms of how can I add proactive value to the salesperson rather than just tell you what your salesperson is doing, right? So yeah, I mean, that's really amazing. One thing I also want to pick up on is, how do you build these high performance sales teams? Sales teams are probably, I mean, one of the hardest to hire and build, right? So what do you look for in a salesperson? How do you put your team together? How do you enable these guys?
Yeah. So I think it all starts from hiring, obviously. I mean, you need to hire right. But there's a lot of gap out there with respect to what are the, I think there's definitely an opportunity on a tool as well for somebody to build like a tool for sales hiring. And I know a couple of my close friends who've been actually working on that idea as well. So I hope that they crack it. But yeah, I think when you look at hiring in general, and look at sales hiring, I think you need to look for a lot of things where what's the track record of salesperson. And most of the salespeople, you'll see their resume will show you that they met their quota, right? I mean, they've always done 120% of their quota. 120% is the most popular number that you'll see in any resume.
Yeah.
But I think what's important is to look at context, right? I mean, if have they sold similar things, have they sold similar problems? Do they even understand the problem that you're solving for, right? I mean, so I always look for a problem identification mindset before I look for problem solving approach, right? So I always look at that, can the person that I'm interviewing be able to identify a particular pain point? So identifying that whole pain point and articulating it in itself is a very important skill, which a lot of sales reps miss. And it's something which can be learned. I mean, it's not a rocket science. It can be learned with a conscious process and an approach. And I would say that's one skill I would always look at, that what is the problem identification mindset and how they go ahead and identifying the pain point. And then after that, you look at how they propose a solution, how they go about doing it. And then obviously there are common things around relationship building, how they go ahead. I think discipline is very important. I think sales is one of the most disciplined function. And if you're not disciplined with your follow-ups, with your pipeline management, with respect to your outreach, you'll again not be so successful as a salesperson, right? So it's very important that we test for some of these things around the hiring side. So assuming that you hired for the right person, then comes enablement and onboarding, right? I mean, that's where a lot of failure points happen. Even if you say hired wrongly, and if you have a great enablement and onboarding process, you should be able to get something out of the sales team. And I think, and this is something which is still in control. There are like some systems available, there are processes available, but I see most of the startups underinvest in this function. They would not. They'll either take a basic learning management system, or they will like get some advisors and coaches will probably come intermittently to guide them. But again, they would not have time and bandwidth to go to a ground level to be able to support you with that execution, right? So it's very important that what founders did initially in the first 0 to 1 journey, from like what the initial sales team did from say a 1 to 5 million journey, all that is articulated in some sort of a playbook. And there is a playbook which exists, right? I mean, it's like a tribal knowledge sitting in everybody's head initially. And they all know that, okay, what needs to be done, what are the common objections, how you need to go about answering those, how do you go about like proposing a use case or even identifying a use case and then like pitching for it. Then what are the case studies you can probably talk about in your examples when you're interacting with that prospect? Which are the people in that organization whom you need to talk to, who are the right roles for you to engage as a company, who will appreciate your product and the way you're solving it? So things like those, right? I mean, and then again, obviously competitor knowledge and your strengths and everything. So all of this like exists in the playbook, which is like a lot of time not articulated. Even if it is articulated, it's not executed properly. And that's where I see there's a lot of gap and an opportunity. And something I would very strongly recommend everybody to invest time in. And I think it starts from the top. The founding team and the sales head needs to do that. And that's where I think the sales enablement function is now picking up. We are seeing a lot of organizations hiring for sales enablement manager or a head of sales enablement. I think it's a very important role to be hired. Like once you hit a product market fit and you start creating a playbook and templatizing it. So that's the middle part of it. And then I think it's all about execution. I mean, how you run those templates, how you probably incentivize your sales team. You need to make sure that you keep taking friction out of sales, right? I mean, one of the things I've also seen as organizations grow, they create a lot of friction and there's a lot of bureaucracy that gets created. There's a lot of friction that comes into selling. The worst that you can do to a sales team is like create friction or blocks in their way. I mean, you need to give sales team a clear game plan, a playbook that they can use, and then ask them to execute, and then run that with a cadence and a discipline, and that runs like a sales machinery. But if you don't oil it well and you create those kind of blockers, and which could be unknown, right? And it's not like anybody does it on purpose. It just happens, right? I mean, as the organization grows, there are many more people and stakeholders getting involved. You need to be sure that what your salespeople are selling. So you need to create like some scope of work which you can deliver. There's a process that need to be followed on pricing approval and things like those. There's a process around agreement negotiation and documentation and things like those, right? I mean, but it's very important that you again keep templatizing for even these micro tasks and micro steps that's involved in sales. Finally, you need to be tracking some important sales metrics when you hit certain scale, which basically need to be optimized. And that is not just the quota or the revenue. I mean, there's many things beyond that, which is like lead to opportunity conversion, opportunity to deals, which basically is your win rate. So basically looking at your average deal cycle, how you can like simplify it. At a stage level, you need to look at where you're spending the most time on as a sales organization, the pipeline cover that you might need as a sales team, and how you can optimize that, the yield that you can get out of your sales team. So I think it becomes a lot more important to then start tracking a lot of these things scientifically. And I would say organizations need to invest in it to be able to predictably scale with the same growth rates that they've done in past.
Right. I want to pick up on a couple of things that you mentioned. One is the whole process setting, right? Processes are like aspirational things for startups because, I mean, they feel like soon as they achieve some critical scale, it's necessary to kind of formalize everything and have a formal process around these things. But I think in that in-between phase, somewhere they end up bottlenecking a lot of things, right? Whether it's like, interaction between sales and pre-sales, sales and service delivery, or, product and whatnot. What are some principles to follow in order to make sure that, people are, as you mentioned, there is less friction to operate and salespeople are free to sell?
Yeah, I think one thing is, as a startup, you'll get a lot of advice at all stages, right? I mean, the day you start to like, even at a 50 million or 100 million era, you'll continue to get a lot of advice, and it only increases with time, right? And you'll get advice on anything from anyone. What's very important is that you take that advice with a pinch of salt and use what is relevant to you. And by relevancy, I mean that what is right for your current stage, what is right for your industry, which is coming from somebody who's been there, done that. I think all of those things are very important because it's easy to say than to execute. And I've seen a lot of founders and leaders in startups who fall prey to it, who end up taking an advice. It's all well intended, but then it's not relevant to them. And that's the first way in which you start creating something which you don't need, or you like overdoing something, whether it's a process, whether it's like a step involved in anything that you do. So when it comes to sales, I think it's very important that you look at what are your goals, right? I mean, if you have an annual target which gets broken down into your quarterly target, you need to be linking it to various things, right? Do you have your sales capacity to do that? Why? Fine. If you don't, what do you need to do there? Do you need to like hire more people, or you need to like improve productivity of your existing sales team, or you need to be like doing more of expansion, or you need to be like going after doing a particular hunting motion? Do you need to change your demand generation? So a lot of those things come into discussion, right? And that's when you start involving other stakeholders. So you need to be a bit more cross-functional. And there, I think everybody's goals and OKRs need to be aligned with a common objective, right? I mean, it cannot be the case that salesperson is chasing, say, order books or bookings, and customer success person is only bothered about retention, right? So they will not have any intention or incentive to support a salesperson in getting a new customer on board. Correct. Similarly, a pre-sales person, if they are not incentivized in closing, they would just be like metering their time, but they will not be going an extra mile to like support you to close.
Yeah.
Similarly, like on the finance side, if you're a business finance person, do they have a KPI around how fast they turn around on a legal
And
contract
not just
discussion?
profitability, right?
Right, and not just profitability, right? So I think it's very important that okay, if it's there's a KPI for a particular function,
Right.
which are the other stakeholders who are involved in attaining that KPI, and they need to also be having a skin in the game. So you need
I
to
think it's
probably one is tie,
yeah.
yeah,
No, it's a fantastic
yeah,
point that you mentioned, right? I mean, oftentimes when you look at individual teams, I mean, it's not just the metrics that they are going after, but it's also how it overlaps with other functions. So you win
yeah.
as a team, right? I mean, the incentives have to be aligned. Yeah, that's a great
Exactly.
point. That's
So
a
one
great
is incentives and second is process, right? I mean,
yeah,
once you define incentives, you have a natural inclination of
right,
people to work together.
right.
And then you need to also get the process to support that inclination of like collaborating, right? So I believe collaboration is one area where I think a lot of value addition can be done. And that's one of the things that we are also looking as a startup on while we are like, that's why I call it as future of sales, right? I mean, it's not about individual selling, right? While people talk about sales, means it's a salesperson who goes and sells, has a quota, and you do the quota, manage your CRM and other tools, and you're done it, right? I mean, there's also a lot of collaboration that's involved. So what we are also looking at when we're starting off Nectar, which is my new venture, is that how you can, one is help the salesperson become better, and how you can help the organization sell together, right? So collaboration, in my opinion, becomes even more important when it comes to sales.
Right. No, absolutely. I want to pick up also on metrics, right? What you mentioned. So there are a few things that are, extremely important. As you mentioned, those efficiency metrics in terms of how many leads are converting into opportunities, how many opportunities are converting into deals, and in what time all of this is happening, right? What are 3 or 4 metrics that you have to be really aware of at, let's say, I mean, a 10 plus million mark?
I would say win rate is very important. You need to look at your win rate and you need to constantly strive on improving it.
Uh,
Second would be,
Sorry, win rate for people who are listening would be like, all the opportunities you have and what percentage you win, or, I mean, is there another way you
yes,
define that? Yeah,
yeah, number of opportunities you win against the opportunities you had in the pipeline.
right.
Yeah, that's your win rate, right? I mean, that becomes very important because that determines a lot of things, right? I mean, so you start from that. You also need to be looking at what's your conversion, right? I mean, from lead to opportunities, right? So that also determines for you how many leads your marketing team needs to generate. I mean, that's whole funnel calculation, that's very important. That what how many number of leads you then need to deliver those opportunities. So I would always keep my eye on the lead to opportunity conversion. I would always keep an eye on the win rate that's there. These two will be very important metrics. Then I'll also look at deal cycle, right? I mean, what is my deal cycle, right? If is it reducing, increasing, shrinking? What are the learnings? And then I mean, on an average, everybody will tell you that my deal cycle is between 3 to 6 months. But if you go at a micro level, you might realize that like an enterprise deal is taking 1 year to close versus like an SMB deal which is taking 1 month. And there is like a particular sector or a particular market where you're taking more time than other. And then you look at an individual level, one rep is closing faster than the other, right? So it's very important that you again try to get everybody to arrive at similar metrics and similar benchmark. That's where you need to be probably looking at individual unit metrics as well, apart from the generic company level metrics, right? So it's very important. The devil is in details, right? So you need to start going into details, and then you need to start looking at your stage performance. So what's happening, right? I mean, so is your pipeline getting choked at a particular stage? And if it's happening more and more, there is a reason behind it, right? Either if it's happening at problem validation, problem solutioning of the problem, that means I think there's something you need to do between your pre-sales, customer success, and your sales team, right? If it is happening at a negotiation or documentation stage, there's something going on wrong around the
Finance.
finance legal process and everything, right? So I think it's very important that you do this whole stage monitoring. So I would say the win rate, when you look at bottom of the funnel, then you look at on the top of the funnel, you look at lead to opportunity conversion. Then you look at your stage performance, stage movement, which basically comes through your deal cycle. These to me become very important. And then I also keep an eye around my expansion, right? I mean, so I would always look at what is the penetration I have in existing accounts. So when you hit a $10 million, you have significant number of logos by then, and it's important for you to be able to farm them. Farming is a lot easier and profitable compared to hunting. While you should continue to do your hunting motion, but if you can like sell more to existing customers, and that only happens when you have like dedicated account based pursuits, you have like account plans
Yeah.
which are reviewed and tracked. So you need to be tracking product penetration as a metric as well within your existing customers.
Yeah.
So I would probably, I mean, if I get another $10 million business, I have to scale to 50. I'll probably track these four more often.
Right.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Yeah, I mean, sometimes I mean people just leave the farming to like a general purpose person who's also doing hunting and who's also doing a bunch of other things, and I figure that I mean uh, that just doesn't work, right? I mean, because a farming mindset is very different from a hunting mindset. Uh, so one of the functions that sales has to work really closely with is marketing, right? And I'm sure you would have worked very closely with your VP of marketing at Capillary as well. What are some ways that sales and marketing can align?
Oh, they are like tied to the hip. I mean,
Exactly.
so I think these two functions need to work closely. So if your head of marketing can't own a quota, that means he or she is not the right head of marketing.
Mm.
And vice versa, if your head of sales can't support your marketing team in outreaches that they need to do to probably generate a demand or create an event or like doing a branding or a PR activity, then there's something wrong there with the VP of sales. So they need to like be supporting each other,
Mm.
because marketing is feeding sales, and then sales is obviously supporting marketing in attaining what they intend to do as a function.
Right.
So I would say it all starts from demand generation when marketing starts bringing leads on the top of the funnel. So how you can constantly support those initiatives, whether they're online digital initiatives which are more popular now, to be able to say generate the demand, to like offline events which used to be like, I mean, which is a thing of past, but I'm hoping like it will start over next few months.
Yeah.
It's very important that the sales teams come together, because a lot of time I've seen that sales team will say that okay, marketing will generate leads, and they'll blame that marketing has not done their job,
Mm.
and sales team would not have like gone ahead and supported them in anything, which is wrong. I think what's important there is that marketing is doing some kind of an event, an activity, or some kind of an asset that they have created. It's sales team's responsibility also to distribute within their Rolodex, right? I mean, all salespeople have got great Rolodex. They will build great relationships, and a lot of them will may or may not be there in your CRM as well.
Yeah.
So the least you can do is like get all these extra accounts and contacts and opportunities. If opportunities still go into CRM, but I would say contacts enriched into CRM, so that marketing can do a better targeting on them, right? I mean, so you can enable them to do better. Similarly, if they are conducting an event, can you get the right audience and attendance into the event, right? I mean, marketing will send the emailers and communication, but a lot of time you'll see like poor attendance, or you'll see the quality of people that you intended to attend is not that great, right? You'll see that too many junior people have joined
Mm.
the webinar or your event versus what you intended to be. So a lot of time I think sales has to take equal responsibility there to support marketing in some of these functions. If marketing is creating a case study, sales team needs to make sure that that case study is being shown to the right people and used. And if a new case study has to be created, salesperson has to take that initiative to support the marketing team to work with that customer or the new account to be able to do a PR around it or case study around it, right? So there are a lot of things which are interconnected where both of them help each other. And I see, I mean, that's one of the times I've seen in a lot of startups, they work in silos. I think it's important that they come under one roof and they work together.
Yeah. I think it can have the biggest impact on a startup. Essentially, I mean, if your sales and marketing teams are on the same page, right? Because marketing will give you leverage and sales will close that. So, yeah. All
Yeah,
right.
it's multiplication effect. Yeah.
Yeah, it totally has that multiplier effect, really, because I mean, things like efficiency, right? Your lead to opportunity or opportunity to deals, even a small percentage point or whatever difference can make a huge impact, right? So, yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. So let's switch the pace a little bit. We'll do what we call a rapid fire round. So short and interesting answers to the following questions. The best sales hack you've used or you've seen.
Best sales hacks I've used or
Yeah.
I've seen. That's a tricky one. I mean, there are a few, uh, but the one that comes to my mind is where there's this. I think there's this prospect where I went to them a year back, and at that time they were not ready. But what I ended up doing was stayed in touch with them, and I would like constantly every month would send them one update or the other. And when they were ready, they I was the first one to receive the RFP, and that ended up being like a $10 million
Wow.
deal for us, like a $2 million ARR. So I think the hack there was like building that relationship and staying in touch on a one-on-one basis. So this whole personalized outreach.
Right.
So while you might be unsuccessful today with that client, but if you stay in touch and then like keep adding value to that person's time, I would say. So
Yeah.
whenever you are communicating with them, and just stay in touch, so business will come.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think we also underestimate how long term the relationship is, right? As a salesperson, it's not just a couple of months or a year. I mean, it's actually many, many years. Uh,
Yeah.
so, one conventional sales advice that you believe is simply not true.
Okay, that you just need to generate more leads. I think a lot of people just talk about, okay, I mean, you have a problem of lead. If you talk to a lot of salespeople and sales leaders that, okay, what's your problem? They'll say that I'm not getting enough leads. So I generally don't take that advice. Well, I mean, I don't agree with most of these people. In fact, in my teams, I would ask my salespeople to also generate equal amount of leads that their marketing team was generating. So I would probably give them a lead quota, that one lead per week is what every rep needs to generate in their own network. And then if you generate your own lead, you can question marketing team for their leads. So that's how I would go ahead. And a lot of time, I think people will just say that, okay, leads is a problem, and they'll just leave it at it, and they'll say that, okay, let's generate more lead, let's spend more money, let's do more events. Because it's not like I don't think it's useful to like get, say, uh, 10 leads when you're not converting four of them,
Even
right?
one.
I mean,
Yeah.
if your conversion is like poor, even if you get more leads, it's just going to be, it's an ineffective system. So you need to make your system more efficient and productive, which is like your conversions on your win rate. Then you can probably demand for more leads. Yeah.
So all the marketers listening to this are crying tears of joy listening to you, Abhijit. Seriously,
Yeah.
you get our plight. So the best thing about sales.
I think the best thing about sales is it's dynamic. You get to meet a lot of people, a lot of new people. There is never a boring day. There's always like pulsating emotions, right? I mean, from a bad day to a great day, from a bad quarter to a great quarter, right? And finally, at the end of it, the reason I'm in sales is that there's this whole kick, the sales high. I call it a sales high that you get like when you close a deal, right? I mean, that feeling of customer saying yes is exhilarating. It's out of the world. So I still enjoy whenever I hear a yes every time I close a deal. So I
Right?
mean, yeah. So yeah. So
Okay,
that would be.
now the downside of being on sales. So what is the worst thing about being in sales?
Yeah, you end up like, I mean, you become a number driven person, right? I mean, nothing wrong with that, but yeah, you live by numbers, right? So a lot of time I think it gets stressful. So it's very important that how you manage the stress that comes along with that job. I think you also get to try, you end up traveling a lot, and the travel is not like the fun travel that you're like going on a vacation. You probably are trying for traveling for business and all, so you'll end up like it
Yeah,
becomes very hectic. You'll also lose your family time. So I think some of those things are there where I think it's important how salespeople should start managing the stress and work-life balance. It just makes them more productive if they are able to achieve that. Yeah.
right. The best sales movie you've ever seen.
Best sales movie. There was this movie of Tom Cruise, which I'm not able to recall. It was quite good. It's one of the first movies I watched when I went to like my first sales conference, which I attended. There was this movie. I'm just trying to look up the name. Yeah, it was Jerry Maguire. I
Oh
quite
yeah,
liked it.
yeah.
Yeah.
Show me the money.
Yeah, so it was a very nice movie. There are a lot of learnings for salespeople there
Yeah,
on how to like work with your customer and how do you not give up and keep pushing. Yeah,
right. So what's
yeah.
more difficult, the 0 to 1, the 1 to 10, or the 10 to 50 journey?
I think the three are different in their own ways, right? I mean, there's a lot of excitement in the three, and I think it's for different people, right? I mean, I would say like a head of sales in 0 to 1 is like a founder, right? A 1 to 10 on VP sales is very different than the 10 to 25, then a 25 to 50 or a 50 to 100. And they could be the same person which scales through that, right? I mean, there are exceptions there that uh, people are able to like do that. In my opinion, I really enjoyed the journey from 1 to 10. I think because you already know that okay, you've got a product. It's and that comes from a personal bias that I'm like a salesperson, right? So I would enjoy selling. In 0 to 1, you are still selling. You're selling to investors. You're selling to your prospects who are working with you. You're selling them the vision. But there is a different joy there where you're creating something. But I think 1 to 10 is when you just created something and you start selling it, and you know that there is a big demand out there. There's a big opportunity, and then this whole sense of like going from a 1 to 10 is where I really enjoyed a lot. And 10 to 50 is equally good, but I would say between them, if I have to choose, because 10 to 50, then there's a lot more processes and templates that you need to keep creating. And then you need to be more predictable, right? I mean, that's what is the expectation. So I would say the fun part is definitely 1 to 10 for me between the three options that you mentioned.
Yeah, 1 to
Yeah,
10 is when it gets real, I think. Yeah.
yeah,
So
yeah, yeah.
the best quarantine hack that you've discovered?
Best quarantine hack. I think what I've discovered for me that's worked well is the number of meetings I'm able to do, number of productive meetings, right? I
Yeah.
mean, I would typically travel so much. The whole fact is that by not traveling, I'm able to do a lot more, right? So that was like an inherent thing that happened with like not doing the travel. So I
Yeah.
could like do from like 3 meetings a day, I could do like 6 to 7 meetings a day. But I try to do them like shorter rather than doing longer meetings. I would probably do a 30. I would not do anything which is more than 30 minutes, except like the podcast we are doing today. I have all my meetings which are like 30 minutes or under.
Right.
I try to do that. Yeah, yeah.
Right. So what book are you reading right now? What would you recommend to people?
So there's this book I've just picked up. Again, I'm not good with names again, but yeah, I'll just like yeah, it's part of my reading list. I started and yeah. So one is I just completed the Hard Things About Hard Things. That was
Oh,
like
fantastic.
quite good.
Yeah.
Yeah, that I liked. And I want to read Selling the Wheel. I think that's something which I've been recommended. So that's I actually ordered and I'm waiting to start that. Yeah,
Okay. So are you a
yeah.
podcast person?
I listen to podcasts. Yeah, I listen to. So I because I run long distances, so I
Right.
would typically run 8-10 kilometers and all. So I mean, you can definitely cover like a podcast episode or two.
Yeah. Yeah. Any
And
podcast
so
that
I
you
would
would recommend?
I like that Ring DNA's podcast, which is quite good.
Okay.
So I listen to that. I also like podcasts that are done by Axel. I think they do good podcasts for founder community. I think I like Andreessen Horowitz's podcast as well. I
Yeah.
think they're also quite good, very informative. Yeah, and I heard your podcast also in the run last fortnight. So
Right.
that was also quite good. The one which you had with Anand at
Another
Nexus, I think
yeah.
that was good. Yes, yes, yes.
Right. Thanks so much. So, we're at the end of the podcast, and it's been a fantastic conversation with you, Abhijit. A lot of insights that I can certainly reflect upon. It's customary for us to end on a super optimistic note, and so if you were to look into the crystal ball and see what the future, has in store, what are you optimistic about going forward in this whole post-COVID world that we're living in?
No, I think we will sail through, right? I mean, humanity will deal with all crises, and it's not the first time we've gone into a crisis, right? I mean, if you look at especially the last century, that was quite crazy, right? There were like four big global scale crises which actually came in pairs and dovetailed each other, whether they were World War, Spanish flu, Great Depression. And I think when we look at now, we feel very proud and confident that okay, the our forefathers and generations before us did that, and I think that's what is going to happen in future as well. When the future generations will look at this moment, I mean, COVID has been the first crisis of the new century,
Yeah.
and yeah, we'll get through it. I think what's happened this time versus like a century before is that I mean, all information is there in the on your fingertips, right? I mean, thanks to the cheap bandwidth, cheap broadband, everybody has access to everything that's happening, and there's a lot of like frenzy around it. So there are real problems that have emerged, and I think it will take some time to heal. But I would say the longer term looks good for a few reasons. One is I think this whole pace of digital adoption, the things like work from home, homeschooling and all of that, which were like distant reality, or even if like there were some solutions out there, they were taking a lot of time to like come into a practical use case, right? I mean, so that has happened, right? I think this whole movement to cloud, I would say, would have even further accelerated. Anyway, like SaaS was getting bigger and bigger every year, and you would see a lot of bigger enterprises focusing more on cloud businesses, getting into SaaS models as well. I know a lot of like big logos against which we used to compete would offer a SaaS-based model or a pricing at least, if not a fully cloud model to compete with us, and we would still win the deal, right? So I would say that I think it's a great opportunity for startups who would want to go into like building cloud-based products. SaaS, I think, would definitely see a lot of love from investors as well. I'm hoping. I think on the sales standpoint, that's what I spend most of my time, and I can talk a bit more about it. I would say that this whole there'll be a great blend of in-person and remote selling now. Previously, it was either like in-person selling or it was like inside sales. Now, I think there's this whole remote selling, which is probably going to be a good fusion, which will come out where you'll do like just enough meetings that you need to engage in person. At the same time, you'll also sell remotely, and a lot of like those meetings will happen. So I would see that going to be very interesting, and a lot of like disruption that can happen. I think this whole collaboration, working with each other, even without being in front of each other, right? I think that thing will become even more stronger. So overall, I believe the productivity will go up, in my opinion, in the long run than what it was in past. So that definitely is going to be quite interesting to see. And there are like some sectors where there has been like a tailwind, and there are sectors which had a headwind. But I'm seeing like in Singapore, when I started going to malls when they just opened up, a lot of retail stores had big queues where customers were just waiting to like go and shop. So I would say like it was like revenge shopping in some sense. And even like all the F&B outlets and all, and there are like some fine dining outlets who are not taking reservations for next 1 month because they're completely booked out, right? So I'm just seeing that this whole pent up frustration as well, which happened during lockdown and all, where people are like going ahead and like probably. So I think there was this 1 quarter gone for most companies, and there are like some impact for future.
Yeah.
But I think over next 18 to 24 months, I think it will all rebound stronger.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think demand is going to be back stronger, I feel. Yeah. And people are going to go out and buy and sell and do all of those wonderful things. Fantastic note to end the podcast on. Thank you so much for your time, Abhijit. You've spent a whole hour with us, right? Thanks everyone for tuning in. The podcast will be available on all popular platforms. If you like this episode, then don't forget to share and subscribe. Until next time, stay safe and take care.